Ima had always believed in quiet strength. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. And she definitely wasn't the kind of woman who announced her power in a room. But what no one at Sterling Corporate Tower knew was that the woman sitting quietly in the back office, the one everyone thought was just admin staff, was the silent majority shareholder of the building itself. When Vanessa Clark, the newly appointed CEO, stormed into the company with arrogance stitched into her designer blazer, she made one fatal mistake. She fired Ima in front of everyone, humiliated her, belittled her, told her she was replaceable. What Vanessa didn't know, Ima wasn't just an employee. She was the owner of the building. And some lessons in business are expensive. The morning Vanessa Clark arrived at Sterling Corporate Tower, the entire building felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just tense. Employees stood straighter. Conversations lowered to whispers. Even the reception desk felt like it was bracing for inspection. Vanessa walked in wearing authority like armor, sharp heels, sharper eyes, and a reputation that followed her before she ever spoke a word. She had been hired to restructure, refine, and rebuild. But the way she moved suggested something else. Control. From her glass-walled corner office, she surveyed the floor like a general studying territory. Within hours, emails began flooding inboxes. New performance metrics, mandatory reporting schedules, stricter compliance standards. Efficiency is survival, she announced during her first staff meeting. Her tone wasn't encouraging. It was warning. Ima sat quietly at the far end of the conference table, taking notes. She had worked in operations long enough to understand corporate storms. Some passed quickly. Others revealed who truly understood power. Vanessa's eyes landed on Ima when a minor reporting delay was mentioned. This, Vanessa said, tapping the printed file sharply, is exactly the kind of negligence that costs companies millions. The room shifted uncomfortably. It was a 12-hour delay due to supplier verification, Ima explained calmly. The data needed confirmation. Vanessa didn't appreciate explanations. I don't tolerate excuses, she replied coldly. People who can't keep up don't stay long. The message wasn't subtle. Humiliation hung in the air. Ima didn't argue. She didn't defend herself further. She simply nodded and wrote something in her notebook. Vanessa mistook composure for weakness. What she didn't know was that Ima had seen executives come and go for years. She understood policies, contracts, and the structure of the company better than most board members. But more importantly, she understood ownership. While Vanessa saw employees, Ima saw assets. While Vanessa enforced control, Ima observed risk. As the meeting ended, whispers followed Vanessa's exit. She's ruthless. She'll fire half of us. Ima closed her notebook slowly. Storms reveal foundations. And Sterling Tower had a foundation Vanessa hadn't bothered to check. Because sometimes, the most powerful person in the room isn't the one standing at the head of the table. It's the one quietly watching it. The tension didn't fade after that first meeting. It grew. Vanessa began implementing changes at a speed that left no room for adjustment. Departments were restructured overnight. Senior staff were reassigned without consultation. Policies were rewritten with bold red highlights. And every time something went slightly wrong, even slightly, she found someone to blame. That week, it was Ima again. During a quarterly performance review presentation, a minor formatting discrepancy appeared in the financial projection slides. It didn't affect the numbers. It didn't alter the outcome. But to Vanessa, it was ammunition. She stood up mid-presentation. Who prepared this? The room froze. Ima calmly raised her hand. I finalized the slides after reviewing the financial summary. Vanessa let out a sharp, humorless laugh. This is exactly what I mean. Sloppiness. Lack of polish. No leadership presence. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one intervened. Vanessa stepped closer to the screen. Do you see this alignment issue? This inconsistency? This is why we're behind competitors. It wasn't about formatting. It was about dominance. Ima kept her posture steady. The data itself is accurate. I prioritized accuracy over layout aesthetics. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. You prioritize what I tell you to prioritize. The silence that followed felt heavier than the insult itself. Later that afternoon, HR sent Ima an email requesting her presence in the executive conference room. When she entered, Vanessa was already seated at the head of the table. A printed document lay neatly in front of her. Termination notice. We're moving in a different direction, Vanessa said flatly. Your skill set doesn't align with our future goals. It was rehearsed, polished, cold. Ima looked at the document, then back at Vanessa. Is this decision final? She asked quietly. Completely. There was no anger in Ima's expression. No pleading. Just observation. She signed the paper without hesitation. Vanessa leaned back, satisfied. Another weak link removed. But as Ima stood to leave, she paused briefly at the door. Leadership isn't about volume, she said softly. It's about judgment. Vanessa dismissed her with a wave. She believed she had just eliminated a minor employee. She had no idea she had just triggered a consequence written in contracts she had never bothered to read. Ima didn't go home after being fired. She went upstairs. Not to the office floor, but to the private legal suite 2 levels above executive management. A floor most employees didn't even know existed. The elevator required a restricted access card. Ima had one. When the doors opened, the atmosphere was different from the corporate tension below. Quiet, controlled, professional. Her grandfather had purchased Sterling Tower decades ago when it was nothing more than a deteriorating commercial block. Over time, he transformed it into one of the city's most valuable corporate properties. Before he passed away, he transferred majority ownership to Ima, not because she demanded it, but because she understood responsibility. And responsibility meant protecting what was hers. She stepped into the legal office where Mr. Karim, the building's senior counsel, looked up from his desk. I assume it happened, he said calmly. Ima nodded once and placed the termination letter in front of him. She made it public, Ima added. Documented. Witnessed. Mr. Karim adjusted his glasses. We've been reviewing her policy shifts. She violated 3 governance clauses and 2 workplace conduct standards within 2 weeks. Ima took a seat. There was no anger in her posture. Just calculation. Buried deep within Sterling Tower's master lease agreement, signed when Vanessa's corporation relocated their headquarters, was a powerful clause. If executive leadership engages in conduct that creates reputational, operational, or ethical risk within the premises, the majority property owner retains the right to terminate the lease within 30 days. Vanessa had publicly humiliated a staff member without due process. She had restructured departments without board compliance approval. She had created documented internal instability. And she had done it loudly. Ima hadn't reacted emotionally. She had recorded everything. Emails, meeting minutes, witness statements, HR documentation. Storms are loud. Ownership is quiet. Mr. Karim drafted the formal notice while Ima reviewed it line by line. Professional. Precise. Unemotional. When she signed her name at the bottom, not as an employee, but as majority owner of Sterling Tower, something shifted. Vanessa thought she had fired a subordinate. In reality, she had insulted her landlord. And contracts don't care about ego. They care about signatures. 3 days after Ima signed the termination notice, this time not as an employee, but as majority owner, Vanessa's morning began like any other. Sharp coffee. Sharper emails. She was mid-call with investors when her assistant knocked hesitantly. There's a registered envelope marked urgent. Legal delivery. Vanessa muted the call, slightly irritated. Leave it. The envelope was thick. Official. She opened it casually. That was the moment her expression changed. Notice of lease termination, Sterling Tower. Effective in 30 days. Ground cited. Executive misconduct creating reputational and operational liability within premises. Vanessa blinked once. Then twice. This has to be a mistake, she muttered. Her eyes scanned down to the signature line. Ima Rahman, majority property owner, Sterling Tower. For a brief second, the room felt smaller. The name registered slowly. Impossible. The same Ima she had fired 3 days ago? The operations staff she had publicly dismissed? Her chest tightened. She immediately called legal. Within the hour, the company's attorneys were seated across from her, documents spread across the table. This clause is enforceable. One of them confirmed carefully. It's in the original lease agreement your predecessor signed. Why wasn't I informed? Vanessa snapped. It's standard property protection language. Rarely activated. Vanessa's jaw clenched. Contest it. The lead attorney sighed. We can try, but her documentation is thorough. You conducted a public termination without formal review. HR protocol wasn't followed. Witness statements support a hostile work environment claim. Vanessa leaned back, the confidence draining from her posture. Relocating headquarters within 30 days would cost millions. Breaking contracts with suppliers would trigger penalties. Investors would demand explanations. And worst of all, the board would ask why this clause had been triggered. Vanessa replayed the meeting in her mind. The criticism, the humiliation, the smirk. She had thought it was power. It had been provocation. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, Ima sat calmly reviewing building maintenance reports. No press statements. No public drama. Just enforcement. Because real power doesn't scream across conference tables. It arrives in sealed envelopes. And by the time you understand it, it's already legally binding. The board meeting was called within hours. Emergency session. Full attendance required. Vanessa entered the executive boardroom with controlled composure, but the energy in the room had shifted. The same directors who once praised her aggressive leadership now looked cautious. Explain, the chairman said, sliding the lease termination notice across the polished table. Vanessa straightened. This is a retaliatory move by a former employee. Silence. The chief legal officer cleared his throat. Not exactly. The signatory is Ima Rahman, majority owner of Sterling Tower. Her authority to activate this clause is legitimate. Murmurs spread across the table. Vanessa felt heat rise in her chest. She was an operations manager. No, the chairman corrected quietly. She was a shareholder's granddaughter. We were aware she held building equity. We were not aware you dismissed her without board consultation. The words landed heavier than accusation. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her pen. Relocation estimates were projected on screen. Contract termination penalties. Infrastructure migration costs. Brand instability risk. Investor confidence drop projections. The numbers were brutal. This could destabilize quarterly revenue, the CFO stated. Vanessa tried to regain control. We can negotiate. Offer compensation. The legal advisor shook his head slightly. Her notice is structured around reputational risk. That weakens our leverage. She documented procedural violations. Every impulsive decision. Every public humiliation. Every policy rushed, without compliance review. It had all been recorded. Vanessa realized something chilling. Ima hadn't reacted emotionally when she was fired. She had prepared. She wants revenge, Vanessa said sharply. The chairman leaned forward.
No.
She wants accountability. The distinction hurt more. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Tower, Vanessa wasn't the dominant voice in the room. She was the liability. Outside the boardroom, whispers had grown louder. Employees had connected the dots. The quiet admin wasn't just former staff. She was the landlord. Vanessa sat back slowly, her confidence cracking under the weight of consequences. She had mistaken authority for ownership. And now ownership was reminding her who truly controlled the ground beneath her office chair. By the end of the week, Sterling Tower no longer felt like Vanessa's kingdom. It felt like a courtroom. Whispers followed her through corridors. Conversations stopped when she entered. Employees who once avoided eye contact now exchanged knowing glances. The story had spread. Ima wasn't just a former staff member. She was the majority owner of the building. And she had just issued a 30-day eviction notice to the corporation's CEO. Vanessa tried to control the narrative. An internal memo was sent out. Recent lease discussions are procedural and unrelated to leadership matters. Operations remain stable. But employees weren't naive. They had seen the humiliation. They had witnessed the firing. And now they were watching the consequences unfold. For the first time, morale wasn't driven by fear. It was driven by perspective. In her office, Vanessa dialed Ima's number. Straight to voicemail. She sent an email marked urgent. The reply came within minutes, not from Ima but from a legal representative. Please direct all further communication regarding tenancy matters through counsel. Cold. Professional. Final. Vanessa felt something unfamiliar. Powerlessness. Meanwhile, Ima walked through the building lobby that afternoon, no longer as an employee but as an owner. Staff who once barely noticed her now greeted her respectfully. Not out of fear. Out of realization. She stopped by facilities management to review maintenance upgrades scheduled for next quarter. Business as usual. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't boasting. She was managing assets. Upstairs, the board began conducting a quiet internal review of Vanessa's leadership decisions. Investors had started asking questions. Relocation rumors were circulating in industry circles. The instability wasn't loud, but it was real. Vanessa stared out of her glass office at the skyline she once admired with confidence. Now, it felt uncertain. She had built authority through intimidation. Ima had built influence through patience. And in corporate warfare, patience often wins. Because power doesn't always sit behind the biggest desk. Sometimes, it owns the building the desk sits in. The meeting request came formally. Not as a command. Not as a demand. As a request. Vanessa Clark had asked for a private discussion with Ima Rahman. It was scheduled in one of the neutral conference rooms on the top floor, not the executive boardroom, not Vanessa's office. A subtle but deliberate choice. When Ima entered, she wasn't dressed like a former operations manager. She wore tailored confidence. Minimal jewelry. Calm expression. No visible triumph. Vanessa stood up automatically, a reflex she didn't even realize. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Vanessa began, her tone measured. Ima nodded politely and took her seat. Silence stretched for a moment. Vanessa broke it. "This situation is escalating unnecessarily. We both know relocation would hurt the company. Investors would panic. Staff would suffer." Ima folded her hands calmly. The clause was not activated unnecessarily. Vanessa inhaled slowly. "If this is about your termination, we can correct it. Reinstate your position. Offer a promotion. Compensation." Ima's expression didn't change. It was never about the position. Vanessa's jaw tightened slightly. "Then what is this about?" "Judgment," Ima replied softly. "Leadership judgment." The word hung in the air. Vanessa tried another angle. "We can renegotiate the lease. Increase rental value. Extend the term. Whatever number you're considering, I'm willing to discuss." Ima leaned forward slightly. "When you terminated me, you didn't review documentation. You didn't request internal evaluation. You didn't verify process compliance. You acted publicly, impulsively, and without accountability." Vanessa didn't interrupt. For the first time, she listened. "I have no personal vendetta," Ima continued. "But I cannot allow executive instability to threaten the value of my asset." Asset. Not company. Not ego. Asset. Vanessa realized something difficult. This wasn't emotional revenge. This was business correction. "What would make you reconsider the termination notice?" Vanessa asked quietly. Ima met her eyes steadily. "Structural leadership review. Governance, compliance, restoration. Public acknowledgement of procedural error." In simple terms, accountability. Vanessa sat back slowly. She had entered expecting to negotiate with someone seeking apology or money. Instead, she was facing someone who demanded standards. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Vanessa understood something clearly. Ima wasn't fighting her. She was protecting something. And that made her far more dangerous. Negotiation didn't stay private for long. Word reached the board that Vanessa had personally requested a meeting with Ima. That alone signaled vulnerability. Within days, external auditors were called in. Governance files were reopened. HR compliance procedures were reviewed. What had once seemed like decisive leadership began to look like reckless management. Investors noticed the shift immediately. Stock value dipped slightly, not dramatically, but enough to trigger concern. Industry blogs picked up on relocation rumors. Competitors began circling, sensing instability. Vanessa tried to stay composed. Publicly, she projected confidence. Privately, the walls were tightening. Relocation projections were revised upward. New office spaces in comparable locations were either unavailable or triple the cost. Breaking vendor contracts would trigger penalties. Infrastructure migration would halt operations for weeks. It wasn't just expensive. It was damaging. During the next board meeting, the chairman's tone was different. "Your leadership decisions have created avoidable risk," he said carefully. Vanessa straightened. "This is a controlled negotiation." "No," the CFO replied quietly. "This is a triggered liability." Silence settled heavily across the table. The legal department confirmed that IMA's documentation was thorough. Recorded meetings. Written warnings ignored. Public termination without formal review. There was no loophole. No technical escape. Vanessa realized something unsettling. IMA had never attacked her publicly. She hadn't leaked information. She hadn't humiliated her in return. She had simply enforced a contract. And contracts don't operate on pride. They operate on proof. By the end of the week, an internal vote was scheduled, not about relocation. About leadership stability. Vanessa walked back to her office slowly, the glass walls that once symbolized transparency now feeling exposed. Employees weren't afraid anymore. They were observant.
Calm.
Even hopeful. Because for the first time, power inside Sterling Tower wasn't about intimidation. It was about balance. And balance was returning. Vanessa looked out at the city skyline again. This time, it didn't feel like a view of control. It felt like a countdown. Because sometimes, collapse isn't explosive. It's procedural. And by the time you notice it happening, the decision has already been drafted. The vote happened quietly. No dramatic announcement. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a closed-door session between board members, legal advisors, and key stakeholders. Vanessa wasn't present when the final discussion began. That, more than anything, told her where things were headed. In the hallway outside the boardroom, she sat perfectly still, hands folded, posture composed. But inside, calculations raced. She had built her career on speed, on force, on cutting through inefficiency like a blade. But speed without foresight had brought her here. Inside the boardroom, the chairman spoke first. "This is no longer about a lease. It's about governance exposure." The CFO followed. "Investor confidence is fragile. We need stability, not escalation." Legal concluded with the simplest statement of all. The property owner acted within contractual rights. Our exposure stems from internal leadership conduct. That word again. Conduct. Vanessa's leadership style, once praised as aggressive, was now categorized as risky. The vote was unanimous. By the time the door opened, the decision had already been formalized. The chairman approached her with controlled professionalism. "The board has decided to initiate leadership restructuring effective immediately." Corporate language. Carefully worded, but clear. Vanessa's position as CEO was terminated. No public scandal. No dramatic removal. Just procedural replacement. Within hours, an interim CEO was appointed. Press releases were drafted citing strategic realignment and long-term stability objectives. Vanessa packed her office in silence. Downstairs, the atmosphere felt lighter, not celebratory, just steadier. The interim CEO reached out to IMA the same day. Formal letter. Acknowledgement of procedural mishandling. Commitment to governance correction. Request for lease renegotiation under renewed compliance terms. IMA reviewed it carefully. No ego. No revenge. Just structure. 2 days before the eviction deadline, a revised lease agreement was signed. Long-term extension. Stricter executive conduct clause. Mutual stability provisions. Sterling Tower remained the company's headquarters, but under different leadership. As Vanessa walked through the lobby one final time, She saw Ima standing near the reception desk, speaking calmly with facilities management. Their eyes met briefly. No smirk, no triumph, just understanding. Vanessa had mistaken authority for ownership, and ownership had corrected the equation. Because in the end, the most powerful move in corporate warfare isn't shouting louder. It's standing on solid ground and knowing it belongs to you. 2 weeks later, Sterling Tower felt different. Not because of new furniture, not because of new branding, but because of balance. The interim CEO had already begun restructuring, not aggressively but methodically. HR protocols were reinforced. Leadership training sessions were scheduled. Transparency reports were shared with staff. The culture shifted from fear to accountability. And at the center of it all, Ima remained exactly as she had always been. Quiet, present, observant. She didn't reclaim her old desk. She didn't demand a flashy executive title. Instead, she attended strategic property meetings, reviewed tenant risk evaluations, and strengthened building governance frameworks. Ownership wasn't about ego. It was about protection. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the glass atrium, Ima stood in the lobby reviewing renovation proposals for the West Wing. Employees passed her with respectful nods. Not because they feared her, but because they understood her. She had never raised her voice. She had never humiliated anyone. She had never retaliated publicly. She had simply drawn a boundary and enforced it. Upstairs, Vanessa's former office had already been reassigned. The nameplate removed. The desk reorganized. Corporate life moved on quickly. But lessons linger longer. The board later issued an internal memo highlighting the importance of measured leadership and contractual awareness. It was carefully phrased, but everyone knew what it meant. That evening, Ima took the elevator to the top floor and stepped onto the private terrace her grandfather once loved. The city skyline stretched endlessly before her. He had once told her, "Real power isn't about being seen. It's about being secure." She understood that now more than ever. Vanessa had ruled through intimidation. Ima had led through patience. And patience had won. Because sometimes revenge isn't explosive. It isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. Sometimes revenge is simply this. You underestimated me, and I owned the ground you were standing on. Sterling Tower stood tall, not as a battlefield, but as proof. Proof that power without wisdom collapses. And wisdom, when quiet, is unstoppable. In corporate worlds, titles change. Offices rotate. Nameplates are replaced. But ownership, true ownership, remains. Ima never needed applause. She never needed to humiliate the woman who fired her. She only needed the contract. And the patience to use it. Because the most dangerous person, in any room, isn't the loudest one. It's the one who knows exactly when to act. And when to let consequences speak.